All right, let's dive right into a really monumental turning point in global history. We're looking at the year 1857 in India. Often called the First War of Independence, this was the exact moment that shook the world's most powerful empire to its absolute core. Today, we're going to explore the historical sources for this explainer to uncover exactly how and why this whole thing happened.
So, here's the big question, right? What actually pushes an entire subcontinent to the brink of rebellion? It's absolutely crucial to understand that an event of this massive scale is almost never a sudden accident. It wasn't just some spontaneous riot that popped up out of nowhere. As we'll see, it was a totally inevitable explosion. Think of it like an enormous powder keg, carefully filled over the course of an entire century, just sitting there, waiting for a single spark.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be hitting 1. Building the powder keg, 2. Tensions in the ranks, 3. The spark that ignited, 4. The uprising sweeps India, 5. Why the movement faltered, and finally 6. The permanent aftermath.
Okay, let's jump into Section 1, Building the Powder Keg.
So for 100 years, we're talking from the Battle of Plassey in 1757 right up to 1857, the British East India Company was rapidly expanding its dominion. The sources point to 4 main pillars of discontent that were really driving this tension. We're looking at aggressive political expansion, deep economic exploitation, heavy interference in local socio-religious customs, and some absolutely severe military grievances. Together, these 4 pillars systematically disenfranchised the kings, impoverished the peasants, and alienated the soldiers over a 100-year period. Let's break a few of these down because they're really important. Politically, the British used some incredibly aggressive legal maneuvers. First, you have the Subsidiary Alliance, introduced by Lord Wellesley. This effectively stripped Indian princes of their independence. It forced them to just surrender their foreign relations and actually pay for British troops. Then came Lord Dalhousie's Doctrine of Lapse. This one is wild. Basically, if an Indian ruler died without a biological male heir, their kingdom wouldn't pass to an adopted son like traditional custom dictated. Nope. It would lapse directly into British territory. Kingdoms like Jhansi and Awadh were effectively just swallowed up by this rule, which turned powerful native rulers into bitter enemies overnight.
Economically, the shift was totally devastating. Before British expansion, India was this massive exporter of finished goods, like fine cotton and silk. But during this era, the entire economy was completely flipped on its head. India was suddenly forced to become a cheap supplier of raw materials, like raw cotton, for British factories. And on top of that, it became a captive market forced to import ready-made, machine-manufactured British goods. The traditional artisans were completely ruined because they couldn't compete with cheap machine goods, and millions literally lost their livelihoods.
And this brings us to a really core economic concept highlighted in our sources, the drain of wealth. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Wealth, resources, raw materials, they were all systematically siphoned right out of India over to England, and India received basically zero proportionate economic return. None. The result? The peasantry was just crushed under exorbitant land taxes to fund all this British expansion, which led to extreme poverty and a devastating series of famines ravaging the country.
Moving on to Section 2, Tensions in the Ranks.
Now, we have to talk about the sepoys. These were the Indian soldiers serving in the East India Company's army, and they were the absolute backbone of British military power in the region. But beneath the uniforms, they were harboring some deep, accumulated resentments. They weren't isolated from the suffering of the peasants we just talked about. I mean, many of them were essentially just peasants in uniform.
These Indian soldiers faced severe disparities compared to their British counterparts. Get this. A British soldier was paid more than 8 times the salary of an Indian soldier. 8 times! Plus, promotion prospects were incredibly bleak. An Indian soldier could never rise above the rank of a subedar, literally no matter how brilliant of a tactician they were. Add to this the General Service Enlistment Act of 1856, which decreed that soldiers could be sent overseas. This was a direct violation of religious taboos for many high-caste Hindus, who believed crossing the sea meant losing their caste. So, yeah, the resentment was absolutely boiling over at this point.
Which leads us to Section 3, the spark that ignited. So that match we talked about earlier, it came in the form of a new weapon, the Enfield rifle, introduced in 1856. Let's actually walk through this physical procedure because it is absolutely central to understanding the immediate cause of the war. To load this rifle, a soldier had to do 3 things. 1, bring the newly issued cartridge right up to their mouth. 2, literally bite off the top greased paper with their teeth. And 3, pour the powder into the rifle. Well, in January 1857, a massive rumor swept through the Bengal regiments. Word was that the grease on these cartridges was made from the fat of cows and pigs. For Hindus, the cow is sacred. For Muslims, the pig is strictly taboo. Being forced to bite into this grease was seen as a deliberate, horrific attempt to defile their deepest religious tenets.
Section 4. The uprising sweeps India. The escalation from that point was incredibly rapid. In February 1857, initial unrest sparked at Berhampur. By March, a sepoy named Mangal Pandey famously attacks a British officer at Barrackpur. He's later executed and quickly becomes a martyr. Then comes the real eruption, May 10, 1857. Sepoys in Meerut openly mutiny. They break open the jails, free their comrades, and immediately start marching to Delhi. By June, massive uprisings are detonating everywhere: Kanpur, Jhansi, Gwalior.
This wasn't just a few isolated barracks acting up, it was a massive geographic sweep. When you look at the scale of it, the rebellion spread like wildfire across northern and central India. It completely engulfed vital strategic centers like Delhi, Bareilly, Lucknow, and Kanpur. And the sepoys weren't alone for long. They were quickly joined by disenfranchised native rulers. We see the faces of legendary resistance leaders emerge here. People like Rani Laxmi Bai, whose kingdom of Jhansi was annexed, fighting fiercely on horseback. You had Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow, and brilliant military tacticians like Tantia Topi. They basically united their local struggles into one colossal fight against the British regime.
Make no mistake, this was an incredibly intense mass uprising. Millions of people, peasants, artisans, soldiers, all participating against a common enemy. The historical sources are super explicit about this. The sheer scale and chaos of this warfare shook the British government to its very foundation. There was a real moment where it looked like the empire might lose its grip entirely.
Section 5. Why the movement faltered.
So, why didn't it succeed?
Historically, there is a strong consensus on a few fatal drawbacks. First off, a major lack of centralized leadership and coordinated military action. They were fighting hard, but rarely fighting together. Second, while they shared this powerful anti-foreign sentiment, the rebels didn't really have a unified vision for what India should actually look like after the British were gone. Third, you just cannot ignore the immense disparity in resources. The British Empire simply had vastly superior military technology, a ton of money, and constant reinforcements coming in from abroad. And finally, the uprising didn't truly spread nationwide. The southern and western parts of India remained largely quiet, and some local rulers even ended up aiding the British.
And that brings us to Section 6, the permanent aftermath.
The most monumental political consequence of all this was the absolute end of the East India Company. Gone. Before 1858, a corporate entity practically ruled an entire subcontinent. After the uprising, the Government of India Act transferred all power directly to the British Crown. A century of corporate rule was essentially erased overnight in favor of direct imperial governance by the British Parliament.
The British definitely learned some harsh lessons and aggressively adapted their strategies. Queen Victoria issued a proclamation promising non-intervention in social and religious matters, clearly realizing that cultural meddling was what sparked the mutiny in the first place. However, beneath the surface, they actively initiated a highly deliberate policy of divide and rule, intentionally sowing discord between Hindus and Muslims to ensure they could never, ever unite against the empire like that again. Yet, the legacy wasn't just shaped by British policy. The sacrifices made in 1857 paved the way for the modern national movement. It heavily inspired future generations of leaders in their long fight for independence.
Which leaves us with this really powerful question. The 1857 uprising was militarily suppressed. The British won the war. But when you look at the massive societal shifts, the dramatic end of company rule, and the enduring inspiration it provided to millions, did this defeat actually forge the very spirit that would eventually break the empire for good? It's something to think about. Thanks for exploring this with me today. Keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.